Do do do. I lost the audio. Do 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 do. Starting in the 1920s to later and around the 40s and 50s, you would likely see that sort of introduction either by, like it said there, Warner Brothers, or from one of the other big studios, Fox, Paramount, MGM, and RKO. The Big Five. Because back then, the Big Five were the ones responsible for most of the movies. Because the studio industry and the movie industry was run by what's called the studio system. So the studio system is basically the business method that these five studios used in order to bump up profits and bump down costs. How they did this was they did everything in-house. See, most monopolies get in trouble for the fact that one particular aspect of everything they have complete control of, and everyone goes to them. Now, the studio system in vertically integrated companies do the exact opposite. They own different aspects, so they don't have to go to anyone else. So instead of being focused on charging other people more, they're charging themselves less, and they're having to have less costs in producing movies. That's what the studio system was. Each of these five companies and some other smaller players, they each produced, exhibited, and distributed the movies. So why did the studio system come to be? Well, one of the big causes, which is not exactly said, but it's very much touched on by encyclopedia.com and Britannica, it's the idea that sound came onto the scene, and sound was expensive. Sound was really expensive and it was complicated. So in order to cut down costs so sound could be done more efficiently and it wasn't as much of an expense, they cut costs elsewhere, particularly by merging and expanding their business so that way they could be vertically integrated and not have to pay for the distribution or exhibition of the films. And that way all three would be under the same umbrella, and that way they could do things much more affordably. So that era of the early 20s, just before the 30s, you see the big mergers of Fox, RKO, Warner Brothers, MGM, all of them merging with other smaller companies to prepare them to become the giant conglomerates that they needed to be for the studio system to work. So that way, in the beginning of the 30s, those big five were fully vertically integrated, and those five, along with three smaller players in the movie scene that weren't fully vertically integrated, but they had market share, these 8 companies had complete control over the industry. They were the ones making everything. So with the studio system now fully in swing, and now that we know how it came to be, it's important to talk about how the different aspects of the film industry looked like during this time. And by 3 aspects, I do mean production, distribution, exhibition. When it came to the production of movies, that's where we start to see what production of movies looks like today. The big things that studios did during this time was twofold. First of all is division of labor. The textbook talks about this a lot, but this is when the era where clear, distinct jobs like storyboarding and set design and all these things, these positions came to be, and labor was divided so that way people had clear-cut jobs with clear-cut purposes for clear-cut results. That is sort of the production jobs, what they are today sort of came to be. The other side of that is, on the flip side, those jobs came to be, and the other thing that sort of came to look like what it is today is the star system. And what I mean star system is actors becoming, instead of just people who played a role, becoming this larger than life character. Because back then, studios signed exclusivity deals with actors because they wanted an asset that the other companies didn't have. They wanted something to set them apart. And one way to do that is get exclusive rights to a good actor. And when they had these actors in contracts, their job was not just to have another actor, but prove to the other, like the moviegoers, why their actor was the best. And that is the star system, making these actors larger than life, making them desirable to see, make people want to be like them, make them larger than life, so that way it draws people to these films and draws people to each company's films and not the other company's films. These two things that were precursors to what movies look like today, along with the onset of sound, all these things together really created the look and feel of what the movies during the studio system looked like. It was movies centered around big stars, movies that were created by an assembly line team, and movies that were with sound and had audio for the first time. That's what producing movies really looked like during this time. When it comes to distribution of these films that they made during the studio system, there's a key factor in all of this. And we talk about distribution as advertising, and they did some advertising, right? Stars were part of the advertising since they were like larger than life people and part of the appeal. Then there's also just like the Academy Awards were created by these studios as to give people a little, put some credibility behind these movies and make people want to see them. But the big thing that these movies did as part of the distribution, it wasn't just advertising, it was packaging. And they packaged these movies in blocks. They block booked these movies, which basically means there was the A movies and the B movies. The A movies were high budget, high quality, the ones that they really focused in on, the ones they wanted to make it a beautiful movie. And then there was the B ones, which were just there. They were the cheaply made ones. And it'd be like now, if you wanted to go see the newest of new Academy Award Best Picture movie that you're excited about, or the newest Marvel movie, or whatever that thing is, you'd have to sit through 7 Velocipaster movies. And it was not great for the movies audience because they didn't want to necessarily see all these other films, but if they want to get to the good, they'd have to go through the bad, and they'd have to pay for all of it. Now, part of this distribution strategy too was also in those B movies, if they didn't quite know if an actor was going to be a star or star worthy, they could throw an actor on a B movie and decide by that performance whether or not they were that kind of material for an A movie. So the block building was an essential part of the distribution strategy of these films, and it was part of what defined the distribution of the studio system era. So the last thing is the exhibition of these movies. In order to really understand the exhibition, you have to understand that back when all the mergers were happening that made the Big Five, the most important of these mergers were either because of sound technology or because these big companies were acquiring chains of theaters. So they acquired chains of theaters, but they also acquired some higher end theaters to make movie palaces out of. But by having high class movie palaces for the upper class viewer and then chains of movie theaters all across, they were able to exhibit their movies on their own terms. And like an example of one of these kind of theaters would be the owned Fox Theater here in Atlanta. On their website, they talk about how the Fox Theater was originally a mosque, and then eventually it was a theater, and eventually it was bought by William Fox, who named it after himself, and who was also the owner of, you guessed it, 20th Century Fox, and the Fox Theater became a movie palace. So with the movie theaters in full swing, with the movie palaces in full swing, the exhibition was locked down, and that added together with the production strategy of stars and having defined roles, and then add that with the distribution strategy of block booking and how advertising through award ceremonies like the Oscars and through having big stars, how that contributed to advertising. All that together, that's what the studio system looked like in swing. And it was in swing, pumping out movies for a hot minute. And eventually, of course, even though the studio system did so well for so long for these companies, the studio system began to collapse. And for 2 big reasons. First is the rise of television. Television had the ability to bring the video to the home, something that theaters did not want to do because obviously they wanted people to go to them to make money. So because of this, people were able to get video at home, watch their own videos, and they didn't necessarily need the novelty of a theater, which led to decreasing sales, which most people consider to be the ultimate killer of the studio system. But the other big thing that killed the studio system was what known as the Paramount decision. The Paramount decision was basically the result of the Supreme Court case against Paramount Pictures, where Paramount was being brought to court because of antitrust laws, because much like the rest of the Big Five, Paramount vertically integrated. And because of that, that was against the trust laws, because in reality, they had become a vertically integrated monopoly. And when brought before the court decided that companies like Paramount would have to get rid of a chunk of or all of their theaters, so that way they were not a monopoly. Because of this, the studio system effectively could not continue, because one of those big three components, the exhibition, was taken out of the equation, because they were doing something which should have already been illegal, but now it was officially illegal and being cracked down on. So the studio system helped shape film into what it looks like today, a big component, through making the star system and making clear roles, and by sort of pioneering all these things as part of the studio system. And though the studio system ended, it still kind of lives on today. For example, just recently, in the past couple of years, the Supreme Court repealed the decision of the Paramount case. So now studios are allowed to own theaters again. And that doesn't really matter, since these companies can also own streaming services now. But the studio system still lives on in certain aspects, and some of the strategies that were behind the studio system still live on today.